In 2020, protesters across the U.S. called to defund the police. Most cities did the opposite.
We need our law enforcement officers, and we need them funded.
Law enforcement departments are now offering hiring bonuses as high as $20,000.
Pay increase for thousands of NYPD officers is in the works. This comes as the city is slashing budgets in other places.
City council leaders voted against defunding the police and in favor of increasing spending on law enforcement officials.
Last year, state and local governments spent an estimated $129 billion on police, despite a falling crime rate, public outcry, and the fact that it's been shown that police don't actually do much to prevent crime. These investments are the latest in a decades-long trend towards militarizing our police and integrating police into every institution we have. But I'm particularly interested in one specific type of investment. So-called cop cities purport to split the difference between bolstering police morale and heeding public feedback that police need better de-escalation and mental health training. But as usual, the money tells a different story, and the consequences of further militarization of our police forces will be devastating for already over-policed communities. This is how cop cities are ruining democracy. Roll the intro. Nearly 24 people are charged with domestic terrorism after a violent protest at a police training center in Atlanta.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist or an attorney to tell you that breaking windows and setting fires is not protest. That is terrorism.
As you'll see in this video, coverage of cop cities and what even counts as a cop city is varied and has a tendency to be a little sensationalized. It's an important topic, and emotions tend to run wild when it comes to the cops and whether or not to defund them. Because of this, bias can cloud our judgment on who to believe and can even affect news sources and how they report on the issue. I rely on some important tools to help cut through the bias and the murkiness in today's media reporting landscape, including my partner on today's video, Straight Arrow News. Straight Arrow News is on a mission to raise the bar on journalism in a time of media bias and mistrust. They do this via fact-based reporting and hearing from both sides with a focus on uncovering the truth. Truly, reading their articles is a breath of fresh air with very little spin, just lots of factual statements. Just tell me the facts, okay? Straight Arrow News is a website, but also a news app where you can get straight down the middle reporting by a news organization focused on keeping bias out of the news as much as possible. In their opinion section, they offer a well-balanced array of opinions from all points on the political spectrum. And their Media Miss tool allows you to see stories underreported on both sides of the political spectrum so you can get all the facts and form your own opinions. Go to san.com/Leeja to check out Straight Arrow News. You can subscribe through my link in the description. When you subscribe, you not only support me, you're also supporting a group of journalists that are raising the bar on news and focusing on serving you the truth. Thanks, Straight Arrow News. Cop City is the nickname activists gave to the 85-acre, $109 million public safety training campus, opening just outside Atlanta this December. This campus has everything: a gun range, a helipad, classrooms, a racetrack, and its crowning feature, a mock city with apartments, a gas station, a grocery store, and a nightclub where police and firefighters can prepare for real-world emergencies. It's expected to serve local, regional, and even international guest trainees. The plan was approved by Atlanta City Council in September 2021, despite enormous pushback from activists supporting diverse causes. Prison abolitionists, environmental protectionists, disability activists, and more have been working together and in parallel creating a decentralized Stop Cop City movement that has drawn support nationwide and proven to be highly resilient, even in the face of violence and intimidation from the government. We'll discuss the logic and patterns driving the emergence of so-called cop cities all over the country as we move through the video, but first, I want to get you up to speed on everything that's been happening with Atlanta's Cop City in the past few years because it's the starting point and the center of the whole movement. In May 2020, as Black Lives Matter protests raged across the country, things turned violent in Atlanta. Numerous police vehicles were set on fire, protesters vandalized the CNN headquarters, large crowds arrived at the Capitol building shouting, "No justice, no peace, no racist police." The mayor begged, "If you love this city, go home." A little more than a year later, after fielding more than 17 very intense hours of public comment, the city council passed the plan to construct a brand new police and firefighter training center. The site butts up against Gresham Park, a predominantly black neighborhood, and it required the clearing of 85 acres of the South River Forest, known as one of the 4 lungs of Atlanta due to how it benefits the air and water quality across the city and beyond. Environmentalists say the land is a critical piece of climate infrastructure that cools surface temperatures, cleans the air, and prevents flooding. It also offers a rich habitat for wildlife and prevents stormwater runoff from causing erosion damage. The South River Watershed Alliance, which bills itself as the only organization dedicated to protecting the South River, has filed multiple lawsuits in an effort to halt construction with no success. Disability activists have also joined the fight, stating that destroying any portion of the forest would impact climate change, which disproportionately harms the disabled community. People with disabilities are at a greater risk of experiencing worsening health conditions due to changing weather, of being left behind during climate disasters, and since many are on fixed incomes, of not being able to afford life-saving equipment like air conditioners or backup generators. Last October, a coalition that included local residents, 3 environmental advocacy groups, and a Black liberation nonprofit filed a complaint with the EPA. They claimed that by damaging the ecosystem in surrounding Black and brown communities, Cop City could be violating Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits entities receiving federal funding from discriminating based on race, color, or national origin. The EPA complaint centers on environmental racism, a term coined by civil rights leader Dr. Benjamin F. Chavez Jr. to describe the phenomenon of placing polluting and waste sites in primarily Black, brown, minority, and poor communities with the fewest resources to fight back. Studies have shown that over and over, the most vulnerable populations are disproportionately exposed to fumes, toxic dust, ash, soot, and other pollutants, increasing their risk of health consequences like cancer and breathing problems. A recent study out of UC Berkeley and Columbia found that African American and Latina communities that had been redlined under the discriminatory Homeowners Loan Corporation program have twice as many oil and gas wells today than mostly white neighborhoods. According to the Natural Resources Defense Council, environmental racism is multifaceted and has cumulative impacts, including mental and physical health issues, economic inequality, the desecration of cultural spaces, and disproportionate levels of pollution. An example you're likely familiar with is the 8-year-long water crisis in Flint, Michigan that left at least a dozen people dead and tens of thousands exposed to dangerously high levels of lead. 45% of the residents of Flint, Michigan are Black. And in the neighborhood next to Cop City in Atlanta, more than 74% of residents are Black or Hispanic. Meanwhile, when affluent majority white neighborhoods pick a not in my backyard or NIMBY cause, for instance, fighting against a new homeless shelter or high-rise condo in their cozy suburban neighborhood, they often get their way. According to Shelter Force, which reports on affordable housing, NIMBYism is often driven more or less openly by racism and classism. But the concerns more commonly voiced are about increased crime, traffic congestion, strain on sewers, overcrowded schools, and lowered property values and quality of life. Yet when Black and brown residents say, "Don't pollute my neighborhood," those calls are often ignored. Though the EPA acknowledged receiving the complaint that environmental activists filed against Cop City in Atlanta, it has not responded, opened an investigation, or provided a timeline for next steps. Of course, environmental racism is just one shade in a vibrant rainbow of racisms. Perhaps one of the most well-known forms is carceral racism, which has seen Black and brown people disproportionately surveilled, brutalized, policed, and incarcerated. If you're interested in a deep dive on the history of why U.S. police are so corrupt, I made a video about that. You can check it out after this. For now, suffice it to say that modern policing is the great-grandchild of slave catching, and that rotten core is the reason a lot of folks don't believe police reform is possible.
So with all of the training that they've been getting for decades upon decades, they are still disproportionately killing Black people. So I don't know that it's really an issue of the training. Perhaps it's more of an issue of culture.
Around 25% of U.S. police officers have a military background. Even those who don't are often trained using what's known as a military model, which promotes a quote-unquote warrior mentality, literally designed to prepare soldiers for battle. This perpetuates a culture that takes pride in combat and violence. When every interaction is filtered through a soldier's perspective, it's no wonder cops are so trigger-happy, even in should-be mundane situations like interacting with someone who sold a few loose cigarettes or used a counterfeit $20 bill, allegedly. Activists note that Atlanta's Cop City resembles another facility, one that American soldiers and police have traveled far and wide to train in. Mini-Gaza is a 60-acre compound that simulates the crowded urban environments of Gaza and the West Bank. European allied forces and recently soldiers from Cyprus have also trained there. But as we discussed in my video about why Congress is so obsessed with Israel, the relationship between the U.S. and Israel is particularly cozy. Their joint political military group has met twice a year since 1983 to collaborate on military and training efforts. But it's not just at the federal level. According to Amnesty International, numerous state law enforcement agencies have trained with Israel as well, including Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, California, Arizona, North Carolina, Washington, etc. You get the picture. And since 1992, Georgia State University has run GILEE, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange. The collaboration with local, state, federal, and international law enforcement and public safety agencies purports to protect civil rights through anti-terrorism training. So, just so we're clear, our police forces are collaborating with Israel, the country that's been credibly accused of actively perpetrating a genocide against a minority population, on how to protect civil rights. Cool. So anyone wondering if there's a chance that maybe the new training facility will be used to practice de-escalation, as supporters have claimed, the Mock City format is seen as inherently militaristic because of its origins. Cop City continues a trend of investing in the police, while social services that actually impact crime rates are gutted. Do you like to be cool, connected, in the know? Do you hate ads with a fiery burning passion? Well, I'm sorry, but this is an ad to join my Patreon community. There you can chat with me and my community, get early access to uncensored and free versions of these videos, and more. So be cool. Join my Patreon. 2 crime analysts recently crunched the data on 911 calls for service from 10 police agencies, including ones with fairly high violent crime rates like Baltimore and New Orleans. They found that violent crime accounted for 1% of 911 calls. Matthew Bostrom, a University of Oxford criminologist and former sheriff, called policing 99% boredom and 1% sheer panic. That is the outcome of a police force tasked nominally with serving and protecting us that has been militarized to the point that their officers think they're actively at war against us. This dynamic already cost the life of one Cop City protester last year. Pretty much as soon as the Atlanta City Council approved the plans for Cop City, protesters camped out at the site to voice their concerns. They managed to sustain a peaceful encampment for more than 18 months until the land developers showed up. Protesters held their ground. According to cops, they hurled rocks, bottles, and Molotov cocktails. On January 18th, 2023, state troopers came to clear the encampment. That's when they encountered 𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗛𝗓𝗏, aka 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗏, in a tent. Okay, I speak fluent Spanish, but I'm also a white lady, so I never know how to approach pronouncing Spanish names in these videos, because if I say it with a gringo accent, it sounds dumb, but if I say it with a Spanish accent, it also sounds dumb, because look at me, okay? So please bear with me through this section. Also, it's not about me, it's about 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧, the activist killed by police while actively protesting against increased police militarization. Police claim they told 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧 to come out, and when they refused, cops tried to smoke them out with pepper ball rounds. Pepper balls are basically balls of pepper spray that explode on impact, so you're effectively getting shot and pepper sprayed at the same time. Troopers claim that's when 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧 started shooting through the tent, striking an officer. Only then, they say, did they return fire. Autopsies revealed that 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧 was shot anywhere from 14 to 57 times, depending on which autopsy you believe. The autopsies also revealed that some of those bullets went through 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧's hands, indicating that they died with their hands up. No gunpowder was found on 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧, calling into question the story about 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧 firing first. And yet, those responsible for the killing have not been charged with any crimes. And according to District Attorney George R. Christian, the use of lethal force by the Georgia State Patrol was objectively reasonable under the circumstances of this case. To those who opposed Cop City, 𝗬𝗓𝗏𝗏𝗧's death was seen as a political assassination, and the backlash was fierce and swift. Some activists attacked businesses and organizations affiliated with the Cop City plan, broke the windows of the Atlanta Police Foundation's headquarters, shot off fireworks, and even torched a cop car. In March, organizers planned a mass mobilization, drawing more than 1,000 people to the South River Forest for a music festival protesting Cop City. On the first day, everything seemed to go fine. There was food, music, tents, good vibes, etc. But on Sunday, March 5th, a group of protesters dressed in all black showed up, and they sliced through the chain link fence cordoning off the construction site and started setting equipment on fire. Not long after, the cops showed up and arrested 35 people. By morning, 23 protesters, only 2 of them from Georgia, despite it being a locally driven movement, had been charged with domestic terrorism. Before the month was out, officials announced an executive order closing the park to the public. While this marked an end to the encampment strategy, activists haven't given up, protesting at City Hall, conducting outreach campaigns, and also lighting a few more fires. In December, a $200,000 reward for information leading to the arsonist's arrest was posted. But in January this year, more fires popped up tied to Cop City protesters. Police are now working on a billboard propaganda campaign to curb public support for the protesters. However, Stop Cop City is not a unified movement. It's easy for the government to treat disparate groups protesting against the same thing as one scary, dangerous monolith. However, the reality is that the actions of some are not indicative of the values of everyone protesting the issue. However, the interference by activists has been successful to a certain extent. It caused construction of Cop City to be delayed, but according to city officials, protesters are also to blame for an additional $19 million needed to complete the project. Originally, taxpayers were supposed to be on the hook for a third of the proposed $90 million price tag for the Atlanta Cop City, but that figure has since doubled. Last June, the Atlanta City Council agreed to cover an additional $36 million, $1.2 million a year for 30 years, to allow Atlanta Fire and Police to rent the space. So taxpayers are paying for it to be built and then also paying for the rent. Federal taxpayers will also be chipping in a cool $10 million in new market tax credits, which is aimed at stimulating business and real estate investment in low-income communities. Yes, you heard that right. The Atlanta Police Foundation, the entity responsible for the construction of Cop City, is getting federal tax breaks to the tune of $10 million by taking advantage of new market tax credits, which are meant to stimulate investment in low-income communities. Technically, Cop City butts up against a low-income black neighborhood, but I don't think any reasonable person would consider knocking down 85 acres of forest and building a multi-million-dollar facility to help cops get better at over-policing low-income neighborhoods as really an investment in low-income communities in the way the new market tax credits were meant to be used. But what's cool about the tax law is that you have enough money to pay a lawyer, you can get around most of it. Much of the rest of what has ballooned to a $109 million price tag for Cop City is being covered by the Atlanta Police Foundation, the largest organization of its kind in the country. In 2021, it raised $11.7 million directly, plus an additional $14.5 million through its affiliated organization, APF Support. This funding supply, not the crime rate or the officer force, is the reason a Cop City of such magnitude is being built in Atlanta. New York City has 20% more officers than Atlanta, but its police foundation raised almost 38% less in 2021. The Atlanta Police Foundation's 56-member board is unusual in that it's comprised entirely of corporate executives. According to reporting by the Chronicle of Philanthropy, none are from a foundation or nonprofit. Bank of America, Chick-fil-A, Coca-Cola, Georgia Power, and UPS have all donated to the Police Foundation's campaign to raise money for the training center and other projects. Atlanta's City Council does not have oversight over much of the foundation's work with the police department, meaning this project is largely being funded and entirely overseen by private companies on the backs of our tax dollars.
So it's really a project driven by moneyed and corporate interests. And the Atlanta Police Foundation is where they funnel that money through.
But what do these corporations stand to gain from Cop City?
A police state that protects their moneyed interests. That's what it comes down to, and that's what they're building the capacity for.
Not just building the capacity for it, profiting from it. In 2023, the Less Crime Act tax credit was enacted, making Georgia taxpayers eligible for a dollar-for-dollar state credit for donations to police foundations. While individuals can be reimbursed for up to $5,000 and couples up to $10,000, business interests, as usual, are the real winners. Corporations can be reimbursed for up to 75% of their total state tax liability. 75%. And this is when it finally starts making sense why so many Cop City protesters have been charged with domestic terrorism.
In 2017, Georgia changes its domestic terrorism law amid a rise in white nationalist extremism. But the new law broadens its definition. Property damage is now technically domestic terrorism if it aims to intimidate the government and change policy. That's the state's argument against 42 protesters so far. A conviction for domestic terrorism in Georgia carries a sentence of 5 to 35 years in prison.
And Atlanta is just a microcosm of the larger issues around policing in this country. 2020 was not a fun year to be a cop. Nationwide, crime was spiking, a deadly virus was spreading, and a massive international uprising was underway that made cops contend with the reality that maybe they're the bad guys. Precincts struggled to recruit new officers, morale was low, turnover was high, police faced screaming crowds, sometimes throwing rocks, and they were protected by nothing more than Kevlar vests and massive arsenals of military-grade weapons. It was a vulnerable time. And like any good enabling parent does when their favorite child feels sad, many municipalities threw money at the problem. You may have seen this map, which purports to reflect all the so-called cop cities that have been built, planned, started, or opened since 2020. The name is a little misleading. As the Stop Cop City movement has spread, the term cop city is getting thrown around whenever a municipality chooses to fund any new construction for its police. It includes this $4.4 million police station in Ellsworth, Maine, its first new police station in 90 years. It boasts outlandish amenities, including a conference room, a break room, and separate locker rooms for men and women. It's also one of the few sites on the map renovating an existing structure instead of building from scratch. So how did it end up in the same category as Atlanta's 85-acre behemoth? Like we've discussed, the term cop city comes from activists, often those who are either full-blown abolitionists or at least in favor of defunding the police. From the perspective of someone who doesn't believe cops should exist, let alone receive additional funding, any spending on police is considered a slap in the face, which is likely why so much of the new construction is being framed as public safety, designed to centralize services including police, firefighters, and EMS. Whether or not that's true, lumping less objectionable departments in with cops is a way for municipalities to soften the blow and conceal what many see as an unacceptable investment. For our purposes, I think it's fair to consider a cop city any new police training facility with a mock city. So not the $108 million Brockton, Massachusetts is spending to replace its police and fire stations with a public safety complex whose biggest bragging point is a parking garage that can hold up to 300 vehicles. On the other hand, the $300 million state-of-the-art police academy being built in Hershey, Pennsylvania, the $170 million training campus that recently opened in Chicago, and the small California city of San Pablo's $44 million police station and training facility definitely do qualify. While I do think it's important to make the distinction, I don't want to dismiss the timing. A lot of police supporting infrastructure projects were approved in the wake of the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. The people who believe cops keep them safe were terrified, and as they always do, felt inclined to double down in the face of opposition. Many of the projects listed as cop cities cite recruitment and morale as central goals of construction. It's a band-aid over a larger problem meant to look flashy and seem like the problem is being fixed without actually interrogating the reasons why cops so frequently clash with the very people they're meant to protect and serve. That same premise may also be contributing to the continued militarization of police. Recruitment videos tend to feature SWAT teams breaking in doors, rappelling down walls, and generally looking pretty hardcore. The promise of fun toys and the ability to exert authority over others is a powerful motivator for would-be recruits. Again, if you believe police fix crime, you're going to be inclined to support the police when crime rises. And if you're someone who wants to fight crime and thinks the police are the answer, you're likely to be wooed by images of force and power in the face of danger from the bad guys. Cop City, then, is as much a state of mind as it is a piece of infrastructure. In an article for The Intercept about New York City's upcoming $225 million training facility announced by Mayor Eric Adams in 2023, author Natasha Leonard points out that while the analogy to Atlanta's Cop City may not be perfect, the similarities shouldn't be overlooked. The New York facility will be built on land already occupied by police at the NYPD Police Academy campus. But like the Atlanta project, Adams' plan will be dedicated to multi-agency training under the misleading label of public safety. If the planned building itself is not quite a cop city, it reflects an agenda that sees the whole of New York as a cop city. The mayor's plan is a grim reminder that 4 years after the George Floyd uprisings, Cop City is everywhere. So the phrase Cop City is really symbolic. It's about the mentality that believes, despite all evidence to the contrary, that investing in police is the best and only way to improve public safety. This perspective tends to be held by people in power, people with money who fear the consequences a plebeian uprising could have on their bottom line. Rather than investing in social services that have been proven to reduce crime in the long term, which would take a while to show solid progress but would also help everyone, investments go toward protecting the wealthy from the problems they created by refusing to pay their fair share of taxes and abandoning or exploiting entire communities. Don't fix the problems, just hide them while making it look like you're fixing them.
80% of everything in our criminal system, all of our criminal cases are misdemeanors, traffic offenses, are nonviolent crime. But you would have no idea if you look at what the media plays up as crime. You would see, oh, robberies, murder, homicide. In actuality, if you're a public defender like me, I've represented over 1,000 people in New York City. You're not getting those cases. They're not a bunch of robbers and murderers and spicy cases. It's just crimes of poverty. And that's the vast majority of who's in our criminal system.
It turns out violence is way more entertaining than watching someone do paperwork. I literally stopped practicing law because it's so fucking boring. So both fictional and news shows focus on the high-stakes, violent interpersonal tragedies. TV shows tend to portray cops as good-natured, heart-of-gold public servants servants, sacrificing their safety and personal lives for the greater good. Programs from Brooklyn Nine-Nine to Blue Bloods to the entire Law & Order franchise focus on moral, lovable law enforcement agents who only break the rules for really good reasons. And when a person thinks about crime that way, first as something violent, but second as something police are good at preventing, which they're not, funding seems super urgent. Protect Captain Olivia Benson at all costs. It's not that cops aren't prepared to protect themselves. They know how to use those tools forcefully and effectively. For everything else, they're lacking. Of course, that's going to end badly. And here in Minneapolis, the heart of uprisings in 2020, I was living 6 blocks from what's now called George Floyd Square, the site of George Floyd's murder in South Minneapolis. That shit was scary, to say the least. Yes, the protests led to entire blocks being vandalized. The 3rd Precinct Police Department is still a burnt, gutted wreck to this day, 4 years later. But despite a man literally dying at the hands of police, despite protesters being brutalized, arrested, shot at, pepper sprayed, despite literal tanks rolling down our streets threatening to shoot us with rubber bullets if we were out after curfew, despite the actual harm that those protests were attempting to address, the lasting impacts in Minneapolis are actually the businesses who decided that the area was too dangerous to keep shop. In the year after the riots, some businesses rebuilt or came back, some small businesses were permanently destroyed, but in Calhoun Square, nearly 4 full miles from the heart of the protests, the storefronts that used to be home to major businesses, Apple, Aveda, H&M, Urban Outfitters, remain boarded up to this day. The major retailers citing increased violence as their reason for closing up shop. While the rest of Minneapolis has rebuilt, largely for the better, that part of town remains a deserted wasteland despite being home to literally millions of Minneapolis residents. Those are the ones, the big businesses, whose interests come first in considerations by our mayor and city council. Those are the ones who matter in the calculations for how much money should be given to the police. And those are the ones pushing for greater militarization of our police forces, because that is who our forces really protect and serve. That is who our domestic terrorism laws protect. Not us. Never us. And yet we continue to foot the bill not only for the increased police presence, but also for the fuck-ups of our overly militarized police forces. Since the death of George Floyd, Minneapolis has created a behavioral crisis response unit, an unarmed unit that is trained to respond to people experiencing mental health crises. And it's been touted as a major success, and I've anecdotally heard good reports about it. The recent city budget allocated $2.9 million to that unit, which is great, but it pales in comparison to the $16 million in taxpayer money that was allocated in that same budget to the consent decree and state settlement agreements with the federal and state governments, penalties against the police force for their role in the death of George Floyd, which we now have to pay as taxpayers. And on top of that, we have suburbanites crying out in Shakopee or Coon Rapids or wherever the fuck, calling us Murderapolis and screaming about how dangerous the city's gotten, how our poor police forces are targeted and demoralized, and also saying horrible racist shit on online forums. And yet, in January this year, the Star Tribune reported, as the police force shrunk in 2023, crime fell across Minneapolis compared to 2022, with murders declining 8%, robberies dropping 20%, shootings down by 25%, and carjacking reports cut nearly in half. The pandemic absolutely exacerbated crime rates here and across the country, but to say that it's because we don't have enough police, the ones who are actively killing our residents too, is ignorant and ill-informed. But it's easier to point to the boogeyman of black men in hoodies and African immigrants and say they're the problem than to stop for 5 fucking seconds, rub 2 brain cells together, and realize the problem is so much bigger than a couple extra cops on city blocks. And throwing money at the police has never and will never be the solution. So that's why people are so heated about cop cities. The good news is, though 26 major cities increased their police budgets in the wake of calls to defund the police in 2020, advocacy groups won more than $840 million in direct cuts from U.S. police departments and at least $160 million in investments for community services. In 25 cities, including Denver and Oakland, officials removed police from schools, an additional $34 million in savings that also meaningfully decreases the police omnipresence in society. According to The Guardian, Portland, Oregon cut $15 million from its budget and disbanded a gun violence reduction unit and transit team that had both long been accused of over-policing black communities. San Francisco officials pledged to divest $120 million from police over 2 years, with plans to invest in health programs and workforce training. Despite the movement in favor of defunding the police in 2020, a recent Pew poll revealed that 34% of Democrats and 61% of Republicans said police funding should be increased. Black adults and Democrats are now much less likely to prefer decreased police spending in their area. This may be correlated to the upswing in the number of Americans who believe violent crime is a very big problem, 61% in July 2021 versus 41% 1 year earlier in June 2020. This despite the fact that violent crime is at record lows and in many cities has fallen from a momentary COVID-fueled peak a couple years ago. While we work to dismantle the system that doesn't serve us, I highly recommend contributing to local bail funds, which provide the money activists need to bond out of jail after being arrested for protesting. Earlier this year, the Georgia Senate passed a bill expanding cash bail requirements to 30 additional crimes, including minor offenses like failure to appear in court for a traffic citation. The bill also limits organizations and individuals from posting more than 3 cash bonds in a year unless they're an official bail bond company. This has caused the National Bail Fund to exit Georgia and increases the need for citizens to be even more engaged in supporting diverse bail funds. The Community Justice Exchange has a directory you can use to find bail funds supporting people near you. I'll leave the link in the description. Shout out to my newest supporters on Patreon, as well as supporters in my royal tiers, and a very special shout out to my multi-platinum supporters, 𝗬𝗓𝗓Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piantek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll also like the one I made about why US police are so corrupt. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.